Welcome to everyone who has joined. We're delighted to have you with us today for this timely discussion on the design principles for special educational needs schools. Before we start, just a few items of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the RSUA YouTube channel. And please feel free to add your questions in the chat box throughout the discussion. Our panel will be answering questions from the floor towards the end of the session. As I said, we're thrilled that so many of you have tuned in for this discussion on the design principles for special educational needs schools. As architects, we know that thoughtful and considered design of learning spaces can be pivotal in ensuring each child can reach their full potential. We know too that investment in the quality of our educational environment is one which society recoups many times over. We have seen how the pandemic has generated numerous challenges for students in SEN schools. The design of space, and particularly outdoor space, needs consideration now more than ever before. Bringing these considerations to life today will be our speakers. We are delighted to be joined by Catherine Ward, the SEN lead at HLM Architects, Simon Bell, Director and Sustainability Sponsor at HLM Architects, Holly Passmore, Researcher at Psychology and Spaces, and Connor Houston, Chairman of the Board of Governors of Fleming Fulton Special School. And joining for the panel discussion after will be Kieran Mackle of Ard Mackle Architects. Finally, a special thanks to HLM Architects, with whom the RSUA is pleased to partner on this event. HLM Architects carry a wide range of expertise in this area, bringing a cross-disciplinary approach to making spaces and places that improve the lives in our education sector. And kicking off the discussion today will be HLM's Simon Bell. Simon is a Director and Sustainability Sponsor at HLM Architects. He's a qualified landscape architect with experience across a broad range of sectors, including education. So I'll introduce Simon now. Simon.
Thanks, Donald. Good morning, everyone. I'll just do a brief introduction and then I'll hand over to Catherine. So for those of you who may not know us, HLM Architects are a UK-wide practice with a studio in Belfast. Education remains one of our largest sectors, and we've designed and delivered schools, colleges and university buildings throughout the UK and across the world, including one of the UK's largest SEN schools at the Penarth Learning Community in Wales, which recently featured in the BBC miniseries A Special School, available on iPlayer, I'm sure, and the first specialist SEN school in Abu Dhabi at Al Karama with the Priory Group. Our team of architects, landscape architects and interior designers really enjoy working with schools and their pupils. I think that's really important to mention. We do an awful lot of work with the pupils to design great spaces for learning. The emerging trends on our work in schools at the moment are focused around things that we all recognise: zero carbon, passive house, modular construction, and of course SEN. And I think particularly in Northern Ireland, we hear in the news the growing need to provide capacity, and that's the same across GB. So it's a huge focus of our work right now to ensure that our school system properly addresses the needs of all pupils. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine now to talk through the design principles of the buildings, and I'll rejoin in a little bit to talk through some of the landscape aspects.
Brilliant, thanks Simon. Can you see screen okay? Everybody see the screen? Yep. Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay. Just a second. So the topic of my presentation today is focusing on designing learning environments for children with an autistic spectrum condition, as well as looking at how this has been affected by the restrictions brought in to deal with the current pandemic. So within Northern Ireland, the numbers of people with an ASC are on the rise and have been for the last few years. And this is mainly due to the introduction of the Autism Act, which brought about much more awareness of the condition and led to an increased diagnosis of the condition. So just for context, research undertaken in 2019 identified that just over 5% of school-age boys and 1.5% of school-age girls were identified with an ASC, and autism levels among children are higher in the most deprived areas of Northern Ireland, with children in urban areas 1.5 times more likely to be autistic than those living in rural areas. And the Belfast Trust has the highest prevalence of autism, with 5.6% of children identified with an ASC. So as you can see, there are an increasing number of learners that have an ASC, and therefore it's important to consider how to design learning spaces that can help children get the most out of their education. And that's what we're going to explore on the next few slides. Just move on to the next one. So one of the first things to consider is proxemics, and this is the study of the way in which people use physical space to convey messages. And this plays a significant role in our daily lives and in the way in which we communicate. And on screen, I've indicated what some of those key distances are. Now, often for people on the autism spectrum, this space is much smaller, so proxemics is particularly important when designing learning spaces. And if we get that right, it can help pupils be less distracted and ultimately more productive at school. And secondly, we consider compartmentalisation. So some autistic people have difficulty understanding how they should behave and react in different situations. And as a consequence, their responses can often be inappropriate and result in stress and anxiety for that individual. So providing clear sensory clues to reinforce what is required of individuals in the different types of spaces can help reduce these negative feelings. And thirdly, sensory overload. So every day we're bombarded with a number of different sensory experiences generated by the various sights, sounds and smells around us. And for a person with ASC, it can have a major impact on their ability to focus on the task in hand. And experiencing several of these at once can result in sensory overload, which affects around 95% of people with ASC. And that impacts negatively on their experience of the built environment. So when we consider this in terms of designing learning spaces, getting the spatial adjacencies and design of the physical environment right is critical. Inclusive environments. So just to summarise in terms of design, to enable our schools to be more inclusive for children with an ASC, we need to be incorporating things like generous circulation spaces and ensuring that routes are clear with clear zoning strategies, and creating node points if possible to help children understand when they've transitioned from one type of space to another, and reinforce sense of place and avoid sensory overload. Let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of COVID-19, the pandemic has been really devastating for children with SEN, and many saw their support disappear during lockdown. So although the return to school was welcomed, due to spatial changes required to help limit the spread of coronavirus, the return to school was quite challenging for children with ASC, and due to ongoing COVID-related restrictions, it's likely to cause further anxiety and emotional upheaval. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to review the changes that could have been made and some of the potential impacts of those changes. So classrooms. So classrooms might look a bit different for a child with ASC, and that's likely to present some challenges. So desk spacing and classroom position may have changed to maintain social distancing. And combining that with having to remain in the same place for longer periods of time, and you have a potential issue. But this can be mitigated by incorporating movement breaks and, if possible, allowing pupils to retain their original place in the classroom. Ultimately, though, good communication with children and their families before making changes is critical to avoid that unnecessary stress and anxiety. Additionally, windows and doors may need to be opened more to encourage ventilation flow and reduce contact time. And this may introduce additional sensory distractions from adjacent spaces, so that will need to be considered. So moving on to therapy and sensory spaces, these spaces play an absolutely critical role in special schools and are typically fairly small spaces that are really well kitted out with various equipment. However, availability of these spaces may become more limited. The additional time to clean the spaces thoroughly after being in use will have an impact on timetabling. So we need to consider using alternative spaces to supplement support spaces. So things like using offices for counselling sessions, or even using the hall to accommodate play or other types of therapy. Moving into the dining hall and dining and halls. So as a result of social distancing, ironically, dining hall spaces may offer children with ASC a better environment as there are less sensory issues in there that are associated with highly occupied spaces. But halls may also be used to provide additional space for breakout and teaching and therapy, as discussed before. So we'll need to give consideration to those with ASC, as this could introduce additional sensory overload issues, especially if there are multiple groups within that space. Circulation, obviously a main point in a school and where there's normally lots of contact between pupils, and in many schools, including special schools, one-way systems of circulation have been introduced to minimise that contact. Again, a child with an ASC might prefer that social distancing aspect, but they may also not have an awareness about personal space of others and may struggle to understand why they can't approach somebody. And additionally, they might become frustrated if there is a more direct route between spaces that they would normally take but now can't use. So again, any change in behaviour expectation that is required of a child with ASC needs to be clearly communicated to them. And finally, interestingly, most interesting space of school, toilets. So limitations have been introduced in terms of the number of people being able to use toilet suites, and that's normally to one at a time. And as some children with ASC unfortunately suffer from lack of bladder control, this will understandably cause distress and anxiety. So schools will need to consider this on an individual basis and develop those strategies accordingly. Some schools might be fortunate enough to have individual pupil toilets and will be able to deal with this scenario much better. But for both scenarios, queuing strategies outside of toilets will need to be considered so that we maintain social distancing. So that's the key spaces covered within schools. I'll now hand over back to Simon to discuss designing landscapes for SEN settings.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think throughout the COVID pandemic, the value of external space generally has increased, or the appreciation of external space, both as an escape from our homes, how we use our city centres, just as an escape, but also as an opportunity to continue to function with lower risk of transmission. So external spaces offer schools that additional footprint to help implement social distancing. So it might be the one-way systems are partly outside. It might be additional teaching space outside, but it also offers the opportunity for diversity in teaching methods, an opportunity to connect with the natural world and the capacity for physical activity. And through our work on schools, some schools clearly value their external space more than others. Some have more budgets to put into their external spaces, but we've had the opportunity to work with some schools to create some fantastic educational and play spaces. So the key design principles when designing for SEN, I suppose the first thing to say is there's no one fit solution. It's very much working with the schools who understands the needs of their particular pupil group, and we work very closely with them to design a solution that meets those needs. In saying that, there are some principles that we tend to include. So the scale of spaces being one, so open spaces to allow kids to burn off some energy, as well as smaller quiet spaces for refuge if the children just need a space away from that activity. Quite often spaces are designed around age groups, as they are with schools generally, but perhaps more so in SEN schools. And it's very important that those spaces are safe and accessible, and that the elements within those spaces are available for all pupils to engage with. The spaces must be engaging. We want to encourage the children to interact and learn and benefit from those spaces. And generally there would be a focus on the sensory experience, so looking at colour, texture, movement, scent and sounds. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the external spaces should really be viewed as a classroom. I think certainly in the design guidance we view external spaces as a big playground some sports facilities, and I think we need to move beyond that. It's really valuable extra space, and many schools now beginning to see the value of that and creating really excellent outdoor teaching spaces that mimic an indoor space. Granted, Northern Ireland, we don't always have the climate for that, but I think we can still work around that. So those spaces could be very close representations of a classroom, like the image on the screen, or they could be much more dispersed with activity panels dispersed throughout the playground, or simply using the playground as a canvas for games, for learning and activity, and particularly encouraging imaginary play. They can offer the opportunity for children to learn and understand the wider world, so how they interact with our everyday things like crossing roads, negotiating steps, ramps, etc. And I think that's really important, particularly in SEN schools as well, where we introduce children to the aspects of everyday life. Next slide, please, Catherine. And I think the importance of the connection with nature should not be ignored. I think there's been lots of discussion around that generally as we approach the climate challenge, but also in relation to COVID, that kind of appreciation of outdoor space and connection with nature. So opportunities for natural play using natural materials, a classroom in the forest, kind of looking at the forest school movement, which has been very successful in dealing, encouraging learning in a different environment, and growing gardens where children can care for and nurture another living organism. I think it's proven very successful as well. So in summary, appreciate the value of the external space and create fantastic learning resources for our children. Thank you.
Hello, I'd now like to introduce Holly Passmore. Holly is a researcher with an honours degree in psychology from the University of Strathclyde. Her research focuses on exploring how inclusive environments can be created to suit an individual's needs. So Holly, I'll pass to you.
Thank you for the introduction there. So yeah, I'll be discussing practical ideas for inclusive learning. So firstly, it's important to not only think about design, but the end user. So in this case, young people. So each person subconsciously aims to fulfill psychological ambitions across their lifetime, across all environments. So these include empowerment and confidence, stable identity formation, so exploring different identities in different contexts before committing to one, secure attachment and healthy relationship management, building trusting relationships with our peers in the world around us, and transforming fear into curiosity and positive risk-taking. So this is something which is essential for learners who have restarted school and will have had to adapt to a new environment and potentially curricula. So in achieving these, we're more likely to experience good mental health, open-mindedness, independence, responsibility, and critical thinking skills. So the foundation of reaching these appears to be competency and safety, having supportive networks and environments, opportunities for exploration, and tools. So everybody has their own combination of foundations, which influences how successfully we can achieve our long-term goals. So young people have been at the heart of the discussion and have been described as hidden victims throughout COVID, specifically during the lockdown period. So our foundations were tested, influencing our resilience and the tools we have to cope with crisis and trauma. So over lockdown, routines were lost, social contact was reduced, and many were unable to access things which support their well-being, which is still the case. So the return to school was a key period for tackling emotional release in a safe way, as this could have been the trigger, and trauma will have manifested differently in each individual. So even now, if this experience is negative, this could be the trigger for releasing trauma. So trauma must not be ignored. Although school may be a familiar place, there is still continually fear and uncertainty around it with exposure to COVID. So in educational settings, relationships and environments become essential. So the key issue within this presentation is the transition phase, which determines how comfortably we can progress throughout our long-term ambitions and takes blended learning into account also. So just now is a time in which we should seize the opportunity to adapt, expand and transform learning. So So in June, I invited learners to describe their COVID experiences, and the gist of their responses confirmed they weren't okay. So this could have been an exhaustive list. However, I've highlighted some of the key responses from the young people. So to reach the core foundations and achieve long-term ambitions, the young person's basic developmental needs must be taken care of. So we can see that COVID disrupted these core needs, which may have or may still be affecting the transition period, as well as the ability to smoothly develop the longer-term goals. So a separate survey was also sent to parents, teachers and inclusive learning organisations across the UK, and this suggested worry across 2 levels. So key issues being practicalities, like balancing working as well as acting as educators if children have to learn from home again. And the other was how we can prepare to achieve better futures for young people. So if everybody across these different learning settings is mindful of an individual's needs, then throughout these environments, as a team, we can successfully rebuild safety and provide support and opportunities. So I'm not going to go into a big description with this slide just due to time constraints, but this is basically, sorry, this is basically top tips just in case blended learning did come back into the picture and how we can prepare learners. So studies have found play to be a critical factor in our physical and emotional development. So spaces for play are vital for young people to socialise, allow emotional release, as well as build stress resilience and positive risk-taking. So we need to provide areas, whether that's indoors or outdoors, that create opportunities to play or to provide a safe space. So there's ways in which the built environment can help our learners. Specifically in schools, a key area is the arrival space. So this should be welcoming and familiar, also providing a sense of calm to manage sensory overload. So if a learner is anxious, this shouldn't be amplified anymore. Equally, if learners feel intimidated, they won't want to return and may experience another moment of crisis. So having large waiting areas also allows for safe distance drop-off and pick-up. Use of courtyards further integrates outdoor learning, exploration and discovery, while roof terraces could also provide another fun learning area, creating an innovative and inclusive space, as well as being accessible. So Holmes Miller's goal here quite literally provides space to breathe, but in the long term, it allows for a more diverse curricula and varied canvas. So 3D Read made a fundamental zoning decision, tailoring spaces to different learner needs. So their ideas provide a portfolio of structured and connected spaces to choose from. So outside of the classroom, learners have the option to use a retreat area to deal with stress or for reflection, and a social area providing the opportunity for small group interaction and play. So having these different zones creates structure and allows children to be themselves, progressing at their own pace and comfort within each zone. So fundamentally, it allows young people to live their lives on their own terms, providing the opportunity to increase their potential. So across schools, areas may become subdivided to manage distancing and to prevent further school closures. So Ryder's ideas offer opportunities incorporating both indoor and outdoor learning spaces, generating a sense of structure and routine, and use bright colours to create easily identifiable spaces to ease any readjustment. So nooks and sensory walls can be used as reflection spaces as well as learning spaces, where reading or other work can be completed in a less traditional way. Movable screens create prototypes of what these areas may look like initially. This then allows observation of how the learners respond. So learners may suggest feedback in terms of the arrangement of the screens, which suit their individual needs. So this helps create options for the future with learners directly involved in the process, which is an empowering act in itself. So it's important for young people to be given the option of choice, whether that's indoor or outdoor, like what Zoni has suggested. So we must encourage exploration of environments in a variety of ways, such as temporary pods or tents, garden spaces, areas to sit and reflect, or play areas to discover and turn fear into curiosity. So pods can be used for undertaking different tasks with sensory considerations, safety and weather taken into account. Whereas tents, on the other hand, may promote inclusive learning, providing a roundtable discussion option and further allowing teachers to move around spaces freely. So although there may be concerns around weather and distractions here, there is a lot of evidence across different countries, such as Denmark, as to how outdoor learning is successfully used in the special education needs sector. So Wardle Armstrong have demonstrated another way of providing structure and incorporating outdoor learning and play. So their idea is around using stations for social bubbles, with each bubble rotating between stations, reducing the risk of transmission while also having a really interesting day at school. So different playground zones could be adapted and used for outdoor lesson plans, with each station supporting distancing and a different activity. So the bubbles allow learners to build relationships and trust with one another, which may encourage exploration and engagement with nature, which is a task that some learners may not have a lot of experience in. So ERZ created an outdoor field school called Hello Schools. So this stands for Happy Education and Learning Outside. So these are modular learning pods made from recycled materials like timber. They allow for both indoor and outdoor learning and can include composting toilets with hand sanitizing stations, tackling the hygiene concern. So these also allow distancing measures to be structured around a positive environment. They're fully accessible, highly sensory and biophilic, and create calm and nurturing green spaces for play and learning. So there's an emphasis on well-being and adventure outdoors, making this an important learning environment. So to conclude, I've created a list of around the top 10 ideas for practical action, covering play as a priority, welcoming environments, carving spaces, protecting nurture and retreat areas, identifiable zones, nooks and niches, adapting outdoor spaces for learning and play, using topography, embracing change and temporary amendments, and adaptable systems. So if we take everything discussed throughout this presentation and put learners at the heart of the discussion, we can build environments which help young people rebuild their core foundations. So with this, we can enable learners to use these tools, which brings us back to the long-term ambitions, promoting a better future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Holly. That was great. And I introduce Conor Houston. Conor is the chairman of the Board of Governors of Fleming Fulton Special School and the founder of the civic initiative Connected Citizens. He works to promote active citizenship and is passionate about creating the space for citizens to co-design solutions for our society. So Conor, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Donal, and I'm really delighted to join you this morning, and I want to thank the Society and HLM Architects for including me in the panel discussion. As I'm a lawyer by trade, so I feel I should give a disclaimer that I'm probably the only person taking part this morning that is definitely not an expert, but I have had the privilege of being chair at Fleming Fulton Special School for just over a year now on the Board of Governors, which has been a real honour and a real privilege, and I've got a real insight into the special education sector and the extraordinary passion and dedication of our staff and our exceptional pupils. So I suppose just really at the outset, just to give a little bit of context of Fleming Fulton School. The school's about 50 years old now. We currently have about 130 pupils aged between 3 and 19. So it's a very unique school that we go right from nursery to post 18. The school, I suppose, is very unique in Northern Ireland in that the majority, I suppose, the context of the school being established and really the predominant theme of the school is for children with a physical disability, which probably distinguishes us from most other special schools. Although over the last, I suppose, 5 to 10 years and becoming exponential, is that the changing profile of our pupils is probably one of the biggest issues that we as a school are having to confront. And I don't think that's unique just to Fleming Fulton. I think that's right across the special educational sector. So adapting to the changing needs and the changing profile of our children is probably a huge priority. And it's why I really commend and welcome this conversation. It's so timely for many reasons, but I think particularly in the aspect of that changing profile, the complex nature of needs, that this is a really important conversation. So I suppose the biggest challenge we face as a Board of Governors in the school is how to sort of keep that focus on our specialism, that is caring for children with a physical disability, but understanding the changing profile and nature of our children. Many of our children now will have an associated learning disability. Some of those learning are quite complex. Some of our children require one-on-one classroom assistance and care. We have sensory needs, we have medical needs. Some of our children require intimate care in terms of tube feeding, etc. So there's a range of complex needs that need to be met, both from a physical and other disability point of view. So I suppose one of the things that, from an outsider coming into the educational sector, I had two immediate observations. One was the moment I walked through the door of Fleming Fulton, the warmth, the love that the staff and the pupils have for their school. There is a huge pride in Fleming Fulton. The atmosphere in the schools where the children just love their school, love their teachers. The dedication of our teaching staff is just, and all the carers in our school, is just really quite humbling. I was there actually on Monday seeing some of the Christmas decorations they put up, and there's just a great, despite the challenging times we're in, there was a great atmosphere and really lifted the spirit. So I think it's important I say from the beginning, because I'm going to make some critical remarks about the school infrastructure, but I think it's really important that I stress that it is a very happy, content school, and we have a wonderful sense of a school family with our parents, carers, staff and pupils. We also have a huge goodwill within the society. We've been very fortunate to have the likes of Belfast Lord Lieutenant, Children's Commissioner, many local politicians and business people who have been long-standing advocates and supporters of the school. So there really is a huge goodwill towards Fleming Fulton. From a board point of view, the concerns I have are probably quite endless, because one of the other observations I had was I naively assumed, well, in a society, surely a special school is one of those areas where you don't have to worry about funding, have to worry about money, and that anything you need for the most vulnerable in our society will just be done. Well, as you can imagine, I had my eyes quickly opened as I realized we had no money. We were constantly struggling and fighting with the Education Authority to meet our very basic staffing needs. We are a partially delegated school, which means that we don't really have a budget, and in fact 85% of our money that we get goes on the heating and electricity at the school. So there's very little left over in that sense. In May 2014, a review was done of our school building and the outdoor areas. And the conclusion of that report was the lack of certainty in the area plan, which I'll come back to, makes long-term planning difficult. And the aging school estate and lack of available capital funding mean the school cannot modernise its facilities. The school buildings and limited outside play areas are inadequate for the needs of the pupils. And that was 6 years ago. And I can tell you that in 6 years, it has got no better. Now, in an immediate sense, since I became chair, we have been able to get some funding to sort of improve some of the area, particularly the welcome area, although it's still very basic looking. I was looking at envy at a lot of the photos that have been brought up, wishing that's what Fleming Fulton looked like. And I've also been very conscious in the past couple of months with our outdoor areas, and I think it's been a point well made through the various presentations of the importance of those outdoor areas. And I was actually on Monday again examining one of our outdoor areas, which should be reopening next week. So there's a lot of work actively going on there. So there is, I suppose, in the circumstance, in the limited and aging estate that we have, we are doing our best and being as proactive as possible. And I suppose then to jump, if that's the challenge, what would success look like for us? Well, I screenshotting a number of those lovely illustrations to go, well, I'd love to be able to present plans like that and bring them forward in our school. And I suppose at the simplest level, and I love that expression of child-centered, I think that's exactly what it is. How do we design the school around the children and their needs? And I suppose how then associated to that, how do we allow for more flexible small group teaching accommodation? Because it is that one-on-one, that intimate care that's really, really important, and that is done very well in the buildings that we have, but could be done a lot better if the built environment supported it. and I suppose making the outdoor spaces much more fit for purpose. I feel that we're making the best of what we've got rather than what they could be for our children. And I suppose then, what is the big challenge that's preventing us between where we're at and where we're going? And it comes down to this existential and two words that have created a chill across any board of governors is what's called the area plan. That is, what is the vision and strategy for the future of special education, in Northern Ireland. Now, some of you may know a couple of years ago there was a really quite a failed, if I can call it that way, exercise which created huge mistrust amongst teachers, principals, parents, and there was quite a bad fallout from that process, where it was felt that the EA and others sort of had if it were a vision that they wanted to implement, whether it was in the best interest of children or not. I suppose really what was felt at that time was there was a one-size-fits-all approach being taken by EA, and there was huge pushback really right across the sector. And really, I think it's fair to say that consultation, I think, admittedly, even in the EAs, but was just not handled well. You will be aware now that there is a new consultation taking place. I was actually on a call last night with representatives from the department and EA. That consultation was supposed to close in 2 weeks' time, and we've managed to get an extension now till February, together with, I have to say, I thought very reassuring messages that this is going to be a genuine consultation, genuine collaboration, and working with the principals and management of the school to design outcomes that reflect the needs of the school. And so those assurances, I think, are very important. And I think the word I've heard again in a number of presentations today is a collaborative approach. And I really hope, and I suppose will use my role as chair of the Board of Governors to make sure that we are proactive in designing that. So just to finish, I'm conscious of time, but I as chair, I'm very privileged to be on a number of boards across various sectors, but I always think it's good to have a number of priorities. And at Fleming Fulton, my priorities for the year ahead, number one is mental health and well-being. We have a number of supports in place within the school, but what I want to do, and I've been working with the mental health advocate for Northern Ireland, Professor Siobhan O'Neill, and Inspire. My challenge to them is I want Fleming Fulton to be the model of excellence for mental health and well-being in special schools. So we're working on a really ambitious program that will be embedded right across the school with our young people, our parents, and the staff. So I'm really excited that we're already implementing that, which I think is obviously so important in the context of COVID and the what I call the crisis fatigue, which is really setting in, particularly with our parents and staff at this stage. Secondly, the governance and leadership. So we're in existential crisis with COVID, with area plan, with lots of things happening. So we're very much working as a Board of Governors to see how we can improve governance and leadership within the school, and engaging in events like this, talking to other sectors and experts is very much a part of that. And I've made it my business to, I think, meet most of the Education Committee at this stage and many other key stakeholders to try and advocate our unique position as a special school. We're very interested in embracing curriculum and opportunities for our young people. How can we make the school more accessible? And we're also obviously looking in COVID how we can make the school safe. How can we make sure the children can interact with each other, enjoy the school experience, but also be mindful that living with COVID is going to be a reality for some time to come, and also be mindful of the lessons from this crisis of how we keep our young people safe into the future. God forbid something similar occurs in the coming years. So I hope that gives you a sort of overview of, from a practical point of view on the ground in the school, of where we're at. I really appreciate the opportunity. I've had the privilege of working with the Society, wearing other hats in the past, so it's lovely to join with you today. And I thank you so much for looking at this very, very important issue.
Thank you for that, Conor. We now have a panel discussion, and Kieran Mackle will be joining us. Kieran is founder of the design and research orientated practice Ard Mackle, and is an associate senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Ulster Belfast School of Architecture. architecture and the built environment. Arthur Sloan, another local architect, had been going to join us. Unfortunately, due to a family bereavement, he is unable to join us today. So our thoughts are with him. So I'll now kick off the panel discussion, and perhaps really as Kieran is joining us, maybe Kieran would like to say something about the presentations so far to get us started.
Thank you, Donal. Thanks very much. Yes, I really enjoyed the presentations, and I appreciate it's very hard to do so within 10 minutes to get across both the ambitions for the school as a building and as an environment externally. So I think there was a lot of good work shown, and it was actually good also to see the schools themselves. In a way, I could have done with some more images of the schools to get a better feel for how they actually worked organisationally and how they related to the outside space. I think the topic is timely, not just for special education needs schools, but also for schools in general, and for how we as society deal with either a post-COVID world or a current COVID world, because there will be forms of COVID with us for a generation or more, probably, I presume. We need to find a way to address that kind of responsibility. I thought in some ways that what I would like to try and tease out as part of the conversation is the space between where Catherine was talking about the building of the school and the classrooms, and Simon's conversation about the external environment, because it seems to me that that kind of transition between one to the other is kind of crucial. Holly spoke about the spaces that had covered areas and potential courtyard spaces and buildings that were also temporary, whether they were pods in the kind of formal physical sense, or whether there's some other kind of material you can use by using plant material and other growth maybe. But I'm just kind of curious, is there a way to deal with that transition space in a way that allows people to have an easy transition from playground through an environment which is also about landscape and has some haptic qualities and material qualities, and then move into the classroom, and that classroom is as rich as some of the other spaces. I see a question from a colleague of mine, Lindsay Daw, about trying to bring in some of those sensory spaces within the body of the school generally. And I think that would be important for all school buildings, if it was possible. Is that a difficulty because of funding restrictions or funding measures, or how the funding is aligned for these school buildings?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, if you would,
Yeah.
Holly, that'd be great.
And Holly as well, yes. Yes, I mean, obviously, where possible with SEN schools, we do try to get that external connection and direct access to external learning environments, because it's so important to have that flow. For children with ASC, you need to make sure that with autism, that you need to make sure that they're clear on when they're outside, what they're undertaking. So whether it's a work or you need to distinguish between social time and learning time, and find ways of doing that. And some of the suggestions in Holly's presentation, where you've got certain temporary structures and things like that, can really help with that. There will be a cost impact, obviously, to implementing those sorts of things, and sometimes there's physical restrictions. So for existing schools, not every classroom necessarily has direct access to the external environment. So there are constraints, but where we can, it's really important to get that external link. I mean, I think studies show that it increases a child's concentration, it boosts health and well-being. I mean, I think we've all probably found that over the last few months, that being outside has been, we've taken it for granted, but it's really extremely important. And a child with SEN is no different, and in fact, it's probably more so. Because there's lots of sensory experiences that are outside that can't be replicated necessarily in the classroom. So yeah, I totally agree that that's really important.
And I think thinking about the learners themselves rather than even the design side of things, like if blended learning was taken into consideration again and kids have to go home. There was a story actually, someone who I know in Wales, her son has autism, went back to school and was separated from his friends and did 3 hours of maths that day. So surprise, he got home and he didn't want to go back. So I think it's about preparing learners before they go back, whether that's during a holiday period or if they were in lockdown again, learning from home. I think it is just having clear communication. And for example, if a classroom's going to look different, providing parents and families with images or videos of what different variations of class activities might look like, just so the learner isn't going in and is totally freaked out because they're not prepared for it.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious though, in a way. I mean, it seems certainly that the ideas and concepts of biophilic design that Holly spoke about, in a way, is fairly generally accepted for health buildings, and I'm just kind of curious why it's not fully accepted within either the educational authorities or municipalities for either special need education needs schools or other schools generally, that is a requirement, a basic requirement for all of us to have that kind of direct relationship with external space and plant and growth material. Because I mean, you mentioned in one of the presentations about the growth of ASC within urban areas, or the higher prevalence of it in urban areas, and given that urban areas have limited land resource in a way, which suggests that you do build taller, you build either 2 or 3 stories, which then puts more removed from the classroom to the external space. And I do appreciate that there is learning time and different time kind of needs and how you would maybe manage the school. But is there any conversation within education authorities generally that direct biophilic relationship between the classroom and the outside space is a requirement and a necessity? Or is it still that the handbooks and money restrictions are still driving that kind of agenda?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really important, and it's something you would expect. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense. But I think they're just, the handbooks and things like that, they're not very progressive at the moment in terms of that. In fact, in England, they've taken a step back, and landscape has almost been diminished to tarmac and grass, and that's it, with an infrastructure to be provided or funded by the school, which have very little funding to do that. There's other things they need to fund. And so, but I think probably what's happened during the pandemic is that's brought it into sharp focus. And so what I've noticed, particularly with some of the projects I've worked on in England, is there is starting to be more of a focus on making sure external environments provide a bit more. Whether we get to the point of where that starts to come into the classroom is something I'd like to push, and I think is absolutely critical for well-being. I mean, we've all surround yourselves by plants and things at home, and we've started to do that in workplaces. So why aren't we doing it in school? So it is something I think we do need to open up to. But we need local authorities, we need people who are funding school buildings to start to open up to thinking about more things like that. I mean, after all, that can save so much money in the long run if we do think about things like that, particularly for we'll provide counselling and things like that for well-being, whereas we might be able to avoid some of those situations to start with by just thinking out of the box a bit more, I suppose. So yeah, restrictions are there, but it'd be nice to see that start to come into classroom design and school design as a whole.
Kieran, if I could just jump in there as well on a little anecdote from it was a presentation I attended actually, so it's not one of our own projects, but one of the pilot Pacify schools in Scotland. I think they were obviously working with the challenge of delivering Pacifies within the school's budgets, and I think one of the decisions that they came to in that project was to actually reduce the floor area internally, but supplement that with external teaching space, which obviously was much cheaper to provide, so they could have their Pacify school and some really good external teaching space all kind of wrapped into the budget that had been set for the school initially. So I think there are ways to make this happen and make it work. It needs collective and collaborative thinking, but certainly, as Catherine says, I mean, the guidance for landscape generally is pretty basic, and it's often to start getting the chop when budgets are tight. But I think we just need a much more holistic view of the facility that we're providing, not simply the building, but the whole facility, and also those other benefits that the savings that can be reaped further on. So, as Catherine mentions on counselling, but even taking that energy approach, I think Connor suggested 85% of their budget is going on heating the building, which is, you know, in this day and age, it's criminal actually, and we need to move that discussion on as well, which is a whole other topic, and spend money on what we should be spending it on rather than heating buildings.
Can I maybe just come in on that? And thanks for that, Simon. I mean, I think what I have enjoyed the most about this conversation and what's happening is that, you know, there is an understanding that everybody in this has expertise, insight, has vision, has ambition. And one of the challenges we have in a lot of times is that vision, ambition is not necessarily within government, and it is not necessarily the approach that government takes. So in various hats I wear, and in fact one of the projects I was involved in, which the society were involved in, was an initiative called Keeping the Cranes Up, which brought together actors from right across the planning, construction, building sector. And again, not an area of expertise of mine, but I was really interested to bring people together to say, well, I'm pretty sure that there's lots of people out there in the private sector who have a sense of ambition and vision for the future of our built environment in the city and wider region. So let's hear from them and let's pull that together. And I think what you're doing today is a similar thing. I think it's so important. And what I would really encourage is to sort of pull that together and to get that out there, and to, I suppose, I think too often, and it's very much a Northern Irish thing, we wait on government to lead the way. And I think that the future is going to need to be sort of collectives of experts, as it were, on the ground, architects, psychologists coming together and say, well, actually, here's a holistic way, here's the principles that should guide and really help to show government what the future of the sector looks like. So that's why I suppose I would really encourage not just to keep having this conversation, but that you try to keep pushing that, because you do have the answers for the vision and ambition of what is needed in this sector.
Yeah, I suppose government always expects all of us to be collaborative and then reaching out and being critical and engaged with people, and they generally fail to do so themselves. Even between departments, you'd expect to be fairly collaborative at some kind of level. But I wonder, though, is there value? I think there's value in the discussion today and whatever will come out of this discussion today. But is there a way to get to the people who write the handbooks in a way that allows them to actually begin to look at things slightly differently? Because, and they are difficult people to engage with, I understand, but is there a way to try and build that? And maybe HLM and others are probably already doing that because of the amount of work you're doing in the education sector. Is that a possibility?
Well, I can speak in terms of England. We've worked with the government in England to develop the DFE documentation in the past, so it's definitely something we've been involved with before. I don't know, Simon, have we done anything in Northern Ireland in terms of getting involved with government?
We haven't, and I think Kieran makes the point that it's quite hard to engage. I think Northern Ireland's got a specific procurement landscape where engagement is always challenging, and you know, I think we wish that wasn't the case, because I think engagement and knowledge sharing and just discussion would help move these things forward. But no, we haven't in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so I'd like to.
Well, I have. I will contact you, Sarah, to see what we can do to take that even just initially forward, because I think it would be really important to do so.
Yeah, and that's where it's got to be pushed, I think, because they're funding, they're driving it. So it needs to come, you know, it needs to come from there. I find if it doesn't, it's difficult to then implement. You know, people don't necessarily. They want to stick to what they're being told to build, and yeah, so it needs to come from there, I think, most importantly.
Yeah, perhaps I could come in there. I'm aware that I have colleagues in government. I'm in government service. I have colleagues in government who are involved with the education side. There are obviously competing demands, but I think the most effective way of getting change is through our politicians. If our politicians prioritise something, then government prioritises it. So if we can persuade politicians of sectors that we feel are important and where to focus, that can have an effect. One other thing I would just like to mention, it's we are mostly talking about a lot of the schools we've talked about have been new schools or major interventions in existing schools, but I'm aware that architects and landscape architects can make a valuable contribution through bringing design thinking to solving problems, and such solutions can be sometimes quite small interventions or changes even in how spaces are used. And I would like to see, because most of our schools are obviously existing, and even if we change handbook standards for the future, we still have our existing schools. And I know Fleming Fulton is quite an old building. There's a lot of things you could probably want to change and replace, but even engagement with architects and landscape architects, even without major schemes in the offing, is very beneficial. And I think we could help schools as professions. We could help schools, and I would encourage both architects to get involved in local schools and also local schools to seek out professional help.
Yeah, indeed, Donald. I think I'd support that. Having been involved with with my own son's primary school and trying to help out there. Yeah, we can, and there's lots of good evidence of fairly low cost solutions as well. So I think there's certainly temporary aspects, and I think in one of the presentations we were recommended not to be afraid of temporary measures, and we've seen that in cities as well in this COVID climate, where temporary and pop-up facilities can be really useful in demonstrating the value of them as well. So we can maybe create something that's quite cost effective, it demonstrates the real value, and then that maybe unlocks some funding elsewhere. So yeah, I think it's really important to do that if we can.
Donald, just to let you know that there have been some questions. Robert Walton asks, do the panel see an increase in demand for sustainable products, and are there enough available to them to deliver the projects in the style they wish to create to deliver the service? So really a question about sustainability, I think.
Shall I kick off on that? I think we as a practice are seeing probably in the last 12 months, and certainly since COVID took hold, an incredible increase in the demand for zero carbon, passive house, those approaches to procuring buildings. In terms of products, I think that's a slightly different discussion, because obviously you can deliver a sustainable building in a number of ways, and it depends whether you're looking at operational carbon or embodied carbon. But certainly I think there's a drive generally towards more sustainable buildings, promoting good health and well-being, using healthy materials, perhaps as a way to put it, and that's obviously been driven by climate change. But I think even 12 months ago, climate change still didn't feel like it was really on the radar of many of our clients, even though it was increasing in the public sphere with the strikes throughout last year. But I think really since the beginning of this year, and certainly since COVID, we've seen a marked change, a marked step change in that. Whether that was coming anyway, I don't know, but certainly we're having a lot more discussion around that area. Certainly in GB, it's also beginning to come through. I think in the schools in Northern Ireland, we've seen the first tenders coming out really talking about zero carbon. So it's encouraging to see that, and we've all got a long way to go with all of that. And again, lots of collaboration required, I think, to achieve that.
And just additionally to that, I mean, just as an aside benefit from the energy saving aspects of those, the health and well-being side of it, the internal environments that those sorts of buildings create, brilliant for SEN schools, for those children that need you know, clean environments, really good ventilation and things like that. It's just great. I mean, I'm working, as Simon was saying, I'm working currently on an SEN which is net zero, and yes, there are some challenges, but ultimately it's positive. I mean, I didn't, as Simon was saying, I didn't think even 6 months ago that I would be working on government projects that would be either passive house or net zero. So yeah, it's great from my point of view as well.
That's great. I'm conscious that we're now after 11:30. So I suppose maybe, unless there's any other questions, perhaps we should maybe start winding up. The first thing I'd like to say is there is a feedback survey. The link, it's in the start of the chat, the meeting chat, but it'll also be emailed out to all attendees, and we'd be very pleased if you could complete that and return it. That's excellent. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all our speakers and contributors for igniting such a discussion. And thank you to everyone who's joined us and contributed to the Q&A. And finally, a thank you to our partners on this webinar, HLM Architects. And if there are any questions which you still have, don't be afraid to send them through, and we will see if there's anything else that we can do. We can follow up with them via email, and I think we will try and have the slides, the presentations issued if that's possible. So thank you very much to everyone. And